Hi, welcome to today's OBSSR Director's webinar titled Toward Data-Driven Ontologies for Mental Function. I'm Christine Hunter, the Deputy Director of the Office of Behavioral and Social Science Research at the National Institutes of Health. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to mention a few housekeeping items. First, today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available in about 1 month on the OBSSR website. Today's presentation will be followed by question-and-answer session. All phones will be muted during the webinar, and questions and comments will not be taken via phone, but they will be taken through the WebEx question-and-answer feature. To ask a question or send a comment, click on Q&A, select All Panelists, type in your question, and send. Feel free to send a question at any time during the webinar. Following the presentation, I'll facilitate the question and answer session and ask the presenter the questions you send. Today's presenter is Dr. Russ Poldrack. Russ is the Albert Ray Lang Professor in the Department of Psychology and Professor by courtesy of Computer Science at Stanford University and Director of the Stanford Center for Reproducible Neuroscience. His research uses neuroimaging to understand the brain system's underlying decision-making and executive functions. His lab is also engaged in the development of neuroinformatics tools to help improve the reproducibility and transparency of neuroscience, including the openneuro.org and neurovault.org data sharing projects and the Cognitive Atlas Ontology project. It is my pleasure to welcome Russ to the OBSSR Director's webinar, and we look forward to his presentation, presentation titled Toward Data-Driven Ontologies for Mental Function. Russ, I'm going to turn it over to you to begin your presentation. We look forward to it. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to focus in particularly today on data-driven ontologies for the concept of self-regulation, but before I kind of dig deeply into that specific topic, I want to step back and just ask a bit about, what do we mean by an ontology? And I think, one person who laid this out really nicely was Bill Utall in his book, The New Phrenology, which, was a kind of an early critique of the field of neuroimaging, but in general, a critique of kind of cognitive neuroscience. So I think he laid it out really crisply here in this chapter that sort of question, whether we really had thought deeply about the things that we're trying to map onto the brain. So he says, unlike lepidopterists who have the relatively simple task of gathering and classifying butterflies, psychologists have few such convenient physical anchors. Organizing the myriad proposed psychological components, or what he called the butterflies of our minds, has been and is one of the great unfulfilled challenges of our science. And indeed, it's not only unfulfilled, it has not, in his opinion, been adequately engaged. And so, when we think about, what it is we're trying to do in cognitive neuroscience, if we think we're trying to map things onto the mind, then the question is, what are those things we're trying to map? And, one way to think about it is, what are the atoms of the mind and how are they related to one another? Now, obviously, one answer for that question came from the early phrenologists who had this, sort of faculty psychology that they'd inherited from other psychologists in the 18th century, and they thought that the atoms of the mind were things like spirituality and locality and order and inhabitedness and so on. Most of us probably don't think that those are the atoms of the mind anymore, but rather we think that they're things, cognitive concepts from cognitive psychology like perception, attention, and memory, and that those are sort of related to one another in particular ways. For example, there's different types of memory. But if you ask different psychologists, you're probably going to get, substantially different answers about, what those, how those things actually are related to one another, and actually, even whether, they believe that, for example, that working memory is a thing that's actually separate from attention. So, when we think about how we might answer this question, I think a thought experiment is useful, and it sort of inspires us to think about how other fields might have answered this question. So let's say that we're a chemist, and we want to know the answer to the question, what are all the enzymes? Well, it turns out that if you want to know the answer to that question, there's a set of books you can go to called The Enzymes, which actually lay out what are all the enzymes that chemists know about. And in fact, you can also go to other resources such as the gene ontology that tell you not just what are all the enzymes, but where do they fall in particular, biological processes. And so the question is, do we have anything analogous for psychology? Where could we look to find an ontology of psychological processes? So you might hope that something like a cognitive psychology textbook could allow you to answer that question, but it turns out that if you look in most psychology textbooks, what you're going to find is kind of the very large scale things like memory and attention and language, the same things that William James talked about 130 years ago in his principles of psychology. But none of these books sort of lays out systematically what do we think the structure of the mind is. And so we set out to try to start to formalize this in a project called Cognitive Atlas. And this is basically a collaborative knowledge building project that was aiming to build a knowledge base, or what we call an ontology, that to tell us what are all the things that psychologists think are in the head, and ultimately the things that we think we're going to try to map onto the brain. So here's kind of an overview of what the structure that comes out of that project looks like. And the first thing to note is that we try to distinguish really clearly between what we call mental concepts, which are sort of the things in the head, sort of psychological constructs like cognitive control or response suppression, and the way that they're measured using mental tasks. And it's often common in the literature for people to conflate tasks with the things that they're measuring. So, for example, they might refer to a working memory task, right? But that's a theory about what that task is measuring. So we try to be really clear about distinguishing those, and then say, for any particular mental concept, what specific aspects of mental tasks do we think measure that concept? And so we have this measured by relationship in the ontology that's meant to specify sort of what tasks are, and in fact, what specific contrasts on each task are measuring specific mental concepts. And then we also have other relationships. So, for example, we specify, for particular mental concepts, are they kinds of or parts of other mental concepts? So, for example, we think that response inhibition is a kind of executive function. Task set reconfiguration might be part of set shifting, and so on. And similarly, we specify for tasks the conditions they have, the contrast, the indicators, the things that they measure. Now, if we ask, what's the right way to go about trying to develop such an ontology? If we look at other fields, what we see is, for example, in the gene ontology, they basically had people sit down in a room and write down, what do we think all the parts of a cell are? What do you think all the biological processes are that take place in a cell, and so on. And that, we've tried to do some work like that in Cognitive Atlas, but I think we have a problem, which has been referred to by various people like Walter Mischel as the toothbrush problem, encapsulated as psychologists treat other people's theories like toothbrushes. No self-respecting person wants to use anyone else's. So the concern is that, when we try to do this top-down approach, that we're going to basically end up with a food fight. And, different people are basically going to be unwilling to sort of accept others' ontologies. So we've sort of, tried to think about how we might go about answering this question in a more data-driven approach. And there's really two ways to think about doing this. One is sort of using the literature to try to tell us, what is the structure that we can extract from the papers that the literature has published. And the other is actually using data from people doing tasks. And so I'm going to talk about both of these in turn, both of these different approaches. And I'm going to focus on self-regulation as a model domain, in part because this is a construct, self-regulation is a construct that's been studied across nearly every different area of psychology using very broad types of methods, from things like, performance tasks like a stop signal task where somebody has to respond very quickly but occasionally withhold response, to tasks like delay discounting or intertemporal choice tasks where I ask you, would you accept a certain amount of money today versus another amount of money in 2 weeks, up to sort of survey measures like impulsivity surveys where you just ask people questions and ask them to sort of self-report where they fall on those questions. We've been particularly interested in self-regulation because it's hypothesized to be, at least many people think that it's central to behavioral change, which is an important question, both for our lab and for a number of the institutes in NIH. So we started by basically trying to see what the literature can tell us about the structure of self-regulation. And so we used PubMed to grab a set of abstracts matching 4 different terms that different literatures use to describe the construct of self-regulation. Those are quote-unquote self-regulation, self-control, cognitive control, and executive function. And after cleaning things up, we ended up with about 18,000 unique abstracts. And then we basically just used the text from the abstracts, did sort of standard natural language processing to clean them up, to split them into bigrams and trigrams. And then we used 2 different methods to try to basically extract the structure, see what the literature tells us about the structure of self-regulation. The first one is something called topic modeling, which basically is a generative model for text, which sort of says, any particular paper is about a set of topics. And so when one goes to write a paper, one sort of chooses a set of topics, and then each topic is associated with a set of words. And so in writing a paper, basically the paper is generated by sampling of terms from those topics. And so we can, using algorithms like latent directly allocation, we can infer, given a set of papers, we can infer what must the topics have been that generated those papers. And then for each of those topics, what are the words that are strong, or the terms that are most strongly associated with those topics? So we can do that we can basically specify whatever number of topics we want to look for, and then it basically gives us back the best answer describing what are those things about. And what we see is when we do that with the self-control literature, moving to the right here, basically you see what happens as we increase the number of topics, and then the words that are shown here are the most strongly associated terms with each of those topics. So the idea is that when we say find us 2 topics, one of them is kind of very generally around self-control, quote-unquote self-control, self-regulation. The other is generally around kind of cognitive control, response tasks, and then each of those, as you can see, as we increase the dimensionality, the links here show the strongest, basically show which topic at the highest level is most strongly associated in its loadings across topics with the next level down. And so you can see that each of these splits out into 2. And then as we keep going down, we see that basically you get this one big set of topics that are largely around the kind of things that that survey measures ask about, which could be things like everything from emotion, self-control scales, things around child development, and then sort of a number of things that seem to be around reward, either eating or sort of delay discounting. And then a couple that seem to be related to kind of medical intervention studies. If we look down at the task measures, the ones that seem to be related to task measures, you see that they break out into a number of them that seem to be more sort of kind of clinically related, and then a set that seem to be really focused around cognitive control. So one thing this shows you is that the literature really does break out into sort of a set of things that seem to be really focused on things that are measured more by kind of self-reports, and then a set of things that are measured more by kind of performance tasks. So we wanted to look at another approach to see if we can sort of see different aspects of the structure. And one of the other common models that's used these days in natural language processing is something called a neural language model. This is one example, which is called word2vec. We use something similar called doc2vec. But the idea is that basically it learns to predict the next word in the sentence based on some set of words coming behind, and it does that by projecting the words through a low-dimensional embedding. So the idea is you have to sort of learn a set of low-dimensional projections of words that in principle should be capturing some of the structure in the data. And then what you can do is look at the similarity of terms. So for example, in this slide I'm showing you, each of the columns in this figure is one of those 20 dimensions. So this is showing the weight of each term along those 20 dimensions. And then they're sort of, these are all terms that are relatively similar in their loadings across those dimensions to the term response inhibition, and then we've sort of clustered them based on their loadings, and you can see that, you know, we get a set that seem to be more about sort of working memory type stuff, a set of, that are, you know, around kind of, you know, interference, inhibition, but there's no kind of super clear structure that sort of falls out of this. Similarly, we can do this with terms from the self-report literature. So this is like the term urgency, and you see that you get, you know, a set of strongly correlated things around kind of negative affective neuroticism, and then a bunch of other terms that sort of pop out as, you know, as being related to urgency, but, you know, no really clear structure. So what this sort of tells us is that, you know, even though we can clearly find sort of interesting relationships from text, building a formal ontology based on text mining is going to be really challenging, in part because language is just messy. Also because, you know, the language of published papers is biased, right? We often write kind of what we expect to be true rather than what the data actually tells us. And so we think that, you know, text mining might be able to provide a starting point and sort of, you know, inspire new ideas, but it's not going to lead us to a solid formal ontology on its own. So that's driven us to start thinking about data-driven ontologies. And, you know, obviously we're not the first to do this. There's a long history in psychology of people using covariant structure models such as, you know, structural equation modeling and factor analysis to try to understand the structure of a particular psychological domain. In the context of self-regulation, this is a well-known set of models from Miyake and Friedman, which is sort of, you know, talked about the various components that they think might sort of drive performance across the set of 9 tasks that they've examined. Now, one of the limitations of all the previous work that we've been able to find is that most studies have focused on a relatively small set of measures. So, for example, in Miyake and Friedman work, you know, they focus on 9 different measures. Others are focused on a few more, but nobody's really examined individuals in detail across a set of measures that captures the breadth of how this construct is measured kind of across all of psychological science. And so with support of the Science and Behavior Change initiative at NIH, we've been examining this for the last few years in a study that we think of as trying to develop a data-driven ontology of self-regulation. And so the primary study I'm going to be talking about today was, it's described in a protocol paper by Eisenberg et al. 2017, and we have the first paper on the data is on SciArchive right now if you want to go there and grab it. It's also first author's Eisenberg. And so we had a large number of individuals, ultimately 522 participants, who did 37 cognitive performance tasks, 23 surveys, and a number of surveys of sort of real-world outcome measures. So it turned out to be about a 10-hour battery, and this was performed using Amazon Mechanical Turk. We included a number of, in addition to kind of, you know, very specifically self-regulatory stuff, we also included things that people often think of being related to self-regulation, such as risk-taking, temporal discounting, impulsivity, emotion regulation, but also more sort of generic things like working memory, processing speed, learning, and other constructs. Now, if you've worked on MTurk, you know that it's challenging to try to get somebody to do this amount of work. And so we actually developed some infrastructure that's available as an open source platform that allows people to come back over time. So basically we said, you have a week to finish this 10-hour battery. You can come back and do as many of the individual measures at a time as you want. And the Experiment Factory repository contains all those experiments. So you can actually go to xpfactory.org and see the code that ran all the different experiments. And then we also use it to manage the data. And as I said, that's currently available as an open source platform. So one thing we didn't know up front was just whether MTurkers would even complete a 10-hour battery. So we were actually really surprised to see that they did. So this is a histogram of the number of tasks that any individual completed. And basically what you see is that, a small number of people came along and did a small number of tasks and then dropped out, but almost everybody who started basically completed the entire battery. So we had an 84.6% completion rate. And then after kind of our first level of quality control, which mostly was trying to drop out people who are clearly either bots or kind of not responding in an appropriate way. So, for example, making reaction times that were way too fast or very low accuracy. We had almost 80% who passed that quality control. Now we're going to, in addition to that, we have sort of, measure specific quality control, and so we some people may be dropped out of individual measures. This is a plot of the demographics, and so we see basically, we get a pretty broad range of ages, and they're, a good gender balance, more heavily white than the population, but otherwise a fairly kind of reasonable sampling. So about a third report lifetime psychiatric history, most of it being depression, lesser anxiety, and ADHD. About 30% of them are obese. 27% currently smoke. Decent number using either cannabis or alcohol. And so we have enough individuals there, who are really falling into these domains that, we think of as being related to self-regulation. So there's a lot of reasons why, cognitive task performance or reaction time tasks, why, measurements of that might be terrible on Inter. These people are using heterogeneous computer hardware. The code is implemented in JavaScript, so we don't have really good control over timing. Subjects, are almost certainly going to be more distracted than they would if they were sitting in the lab doing these tasks. Nonetheless, we actually see performance that's pretty reasonable. So this is, on the left, this is a plot of the means across all the 522 subjects of reaction times on the Stroop task for either in blue congruent or orange incongruent. We see that the difference, the Stroop effect is the difference between those. And our Stroop effect is somewhat smaller than what's often seen in the literature, but nonetheless, our reaction times are sort of, roughly in the range of what's seen in the literature of data collected in the lab. This is across 53 different data sets. And so we think it's actually pretty reasonable. This is another comparison with published data from one study from Lopez Garcia et al. On the pattern expectancy task, and we see that when we plot our values for both error rates and reaction times against that study, we're actually right in the ballpark of where we should be. So we know that when surveys are developed, they're almost invariably developed with test-retest reliability as one of the driving factors, and it's almost always measured for those surveys. But in the cognitive literature, people very rarely measure retest reliability, and so we thought it was important to characterize this. So we invited back 150 subjects to complete the entire battery again after a delay of 2 to 4 months, and then we're going to compute reliability using interclass correlation separately, both for the cognitive task variables. So there's 132 variables that come out of these tasks, because each particular task might have multiple variables, and then also for the survey subscales. And so this is what we see for our data. If we, basically we see that the survey measures, which are shown here in red, in general have high reliability, as you might expect. The cognitive measures have a much broader range of reliabilities, with their median being above 0.5. Some of them are up in an acceptable range, above 0.8. But there's some number of them that are actually down basically in the zero reliability domain. And we wanted to know kind of where we sit with respect to the literature, and it turns out that we're actually not too far off from the literature. That our survey reliabilities are actually a little bit higher than what's been seen in the literature in general. Our task reliabilities are a little bit lower, but in general not too far off. So we think we can be one. This tells us that again, MTurk data seem to be reasonably reliable, and also that we're sort of in the range of what people have seen. Now, one issue with reaction times is that there's a number of reasons that reaction times can vary that basically reflect the trade-off between speed and accuracy rather than kind of fundamental differences in how information is being processed. And so one of the ways that in the literature people like to decompose performance into more interpretable components is using information accumulation models such as the drift diffusion model. So the idea is that, as one goes to perform a task, there's an accumulation of information or evidence towards a response over time. and that we can model the rate of that accumulation, which tells us something about information processing. We can also model the threshold or the amount of evidence that the person requires that you can think of as a measure of caution. And then you can also measure basically the amount of time to just encode the stimulus and to actually make the response, what we call non-decision time. And so we wanted to compare the reliabilities of these, versus the reliabilities of kind of raw reaction time measures. And so there's we're splitting things out into two different sets here. On the left, you see basically data for like mean reaction time or mean diffusion parameters computed across all trials. And what you can see is that they're reasonably reliable for the most part. On the other hand, if we compute condition differences, so for example, in most studies, the things we care about are not how fast is the person overall, but how fast are they in one condition versus another. For example, in the STRUT task, how fast are they in congruent versus incongruent trials. And there we see that both reaction time measures, raw reaction time measures, and diffusion measures are actually remarkably low in their reliability. It's sort of mathematically necessary that differences are going to be less reliable than overall means, but nonetheless, it's sort of a little bit worrisome that these measures, these difference measures, which are the ones that cognitive people generally care about, actually have very low reliability, below what one would generally want in order to use them as trait measures. We'll return to this in a bit because there's actually ways to sort of make this better. So the next question we wanted to ask is, in terms of the structure of the domain, how are these different measures related to one another? And so in particular, how are task and survey measures related? So what you see on the right here is a correlation matrix. It's actually absolute correlation, since some of these measures can go one way or the other. Correlation measures between all the variables in the study as presented as a heat map. And then basically what you can see is that there's reasonably strong correlations within survey measures, somewhat lesser, but in some cases fairly strong correlations within task variables, and very little between them. So one thing we wanted to do is just ask, is there quantitatively a stronger relationship kind of within versus between? So what we did was to threshold this for trying to correct for the number of tests that we did using non-parametric randomization tests with a maximum statistic, and then plot them out as a network. And so basically what this shows is that on the left you see the task associations, on the right, task variables, and each link here reflects a corrected significant positive absolute correlation between those variables. So on the left, you're seeing tasks. On the right, you're seeing surveys. So the surveys, you can see, are really strongly related to one another. So of all the possible correlations that could exist, 39% of those actually exist. For the task, it's a little bit lower. It's 9.5% of all possible associations. But if you look between tasks and surveys, you see that only 0.2% of all possible correlations are actually significant. So it shows us that there's much more correlation within these different types of measures than there is between them. And so in general, one first takeaway from this is that it's actually, we need to treat surveys and tasks as really separate things. There's lots of reasons that could be the case. We can come back and discuss those later. But we wanted to then dig in deeper within each of those domains and ask, what kind of structure pops out. And so we did this using exploratory factor analysis. And if you've worked with factor analysis, there's lots of different ways to determine the optimal dimensionality. We used Bayesian information criterion, but we can talk about what comes out with other methods. So the idea is we take the data for each individual on each variable and reduce those into a set of factors. And then for each individual, we can also get a loading on that particular factor. Now, one thing that we are going to be doing throughout the rest of that I'm going to be talking about throughout the rest of the study is, in general, using computing things based on factor loadings rather than based on raw measures. And one of the reasons for this is that working in factor space just leads to cleaner structure. So what I'm showing you here is, if we take all the measures and compute the distance between them, either in factor space or in kind of their raw data space, and then cluster them using multidimensional scaling, what you see is that similar types of measures fall much closer to one another in multidimensional space if we're computing their distance using the factor loadings rather than the raw measures. So it really does seem to kind of clean up the space here. So when we do the task factor analysis, we do factor analysis across all the task variables, we get 5 factors that come out, and these are our labels on the left that we've sort of given to those factors. And then on the right, we're showing kind of the strongest, the variables that have the strongest loading on those particular factors. So one is the, kind of what you expect from the positive manifold, this kind of strategic information processing, or G factor, which loads on working memory measures and Raven scores. We get another one that we call the speeded information processing measure, and that maps across a bunch of different tasks on the drift rates from the diffusion model, which is basically speed of information processing. We get another one that basically maps onto caution across a number of the different measures, basically the thresholds from the drift diffusion model. And then we get another interesting one that we call perception and response, which maps on both to the drift diffusion model non-decision times, but also interestingly across a number of different versions of the stop signal tasks we use onto stop signal reaction times, which I'll come back and say a bit about later. And then finally, we get a really tight factor around measures of delay discounting across multiple different tasks. So, when we get these factors out, these tell us kind of the low dimensional structure, but what we can also then do is basically cluster across that structure to see kind of how different individual variables relate to one another, to try to give us some better insight into, what each of these factors might be measuring. And so this is basically what you're seeing here is along the bottom is a heat map of loading for each variable. So each column in this figure is one of the variables, and each row is one of the factors. And so the color map basically tells you how strongly each of these variables loads onto one of those factors. So what we can do is kind of dig in a bit more deeply. So I'm kind of flipping it on its side here, and let's look at one of those. This is the factor that maps onto, so this is a cluster of measures that maps very strongly onto the discounting factor, and you can see that this is across, 3 different measures of delay discounting: the discount titrate measure, the curving measure, and the Bickel titrator. That we see, that those kind of cluster really closely together. Now, some of the other ones, also seem pretty clearly kind of unidimensional. So, for example, this is a number of measures of threshold on different tasks coming from the drift diffusion model, and also bias on the go/no-go task. And you can see that it maps kind of pretty strongly onto the caution factor and not very strongly onto the others. Here's another one that I mentioned. This is the set of non-decision times that map pretty closely onto that perceptual response dimension. Here's yet another one that seems to map onto speeded information processing, so drift measures on a bunch of different tasks, but also sort of interesting other sorts of things popping into there. And then if we look at the measures that map onto this strategic information processing factor, one interesting thing that comes out is that we get 2 different sort of clusters here. The one at the bottom maps pretty unidimensionally onto the strategic information processing factor, whereas the top one maps both onto that factor and onto the speeded information processing factor. And interestingly, the top one contains digit span, the bottom one contains spatial span. So if if we were just calling these quote unquote working memory tasks, we would think that they're both sort of measuring the same thing. But actually, these data suggest to us that that those 2 tasks actually are falling in a somewhat different spot with respect to their loading on these different aspects of performance. So again, providing some utility for moving beyond the kind of the intuitive task labels towards this kind of data-driven ontology. So if we look at factor analysis, we actually get a much more high dimensional. I think there's 13 factors here. And most of them map onto things that that we would have expected in the impulsivity literature, like reward sensitivity and this kind of lack of premeditation or non-planning, mindfulness. We also get some map onto more personality sorts of things. So, for example, goal-directedness or agreeableness, and some that are much more specific. So, for example, one that's really focused on eating, several that are focused on specific aspects of risk-taking or risk perception from the Dotsford measure. So if we do the same analysis here, we see that we can visualize the factors in the heat map below, and then cluster the different measures. And so let's dig into this one particular one that we refer to as the self-control cluster. It maps most heavily onto this sort of impulsivity factor, and to a lesser degree on this kind of goal-directedness and mindfulness factors. And you can see that this sort of pulls out a lot of the measures that are often referred to as sort of self-control or impulsivity sorts of measures. If you'll notice at the top, I'm showing you the same data as below in a polar plot, and this is really just to kind of give you a better feel for sort of the fingerprint of this particular cluster with respect to each spoke in this polar plot is one of the factors, and this is basically showing you how much this particular set of measures loads across those different factors. And in part, just to make it clear that just looking at individual factors doesn't tell you the whole story. That if we do this sort of clustering approach, we can see that there's sets of measures that really move together across several of the different factors. So we're really thinking of measures as being embedded in this high-dimensional factor space, and not necessarily thinking of the factors as kind of ontology elements on their own. Now, I mentioned earlier that the task measures had really low reliability. It turns out that the reliability of the factor analysis scores for subjects is actually much better than the reliability of the individual test variables, and actually is pretty much in the range that we would want for doing trait-like measures. So what we did was we took the data from, we set aside the data from the 150 individuals who had done the test-retest study. We computed the factor structure on the remaining 370 something individuals, I think, and then use that factor structure to get loadings for the individuals in the test-retest sample, and then computed the retest reliability of those factor scores, and so that there's no sort of influence of the data that we're testing reliability of on the factor analysis. And what we see is that if you look at the top, the reliabilities are actually quite good for these scores. Often, most of them are in at least the 70s, and the information processing measures are actually up above 0.8, suggesting that whereas we probably don't want to be using individual task variables as sort of as trait-like measures for individuals in different studies, that these factor scores actually seem to do a pretty good job. Okay, so just to summarize, we see that the task and self-report measures are almost completely unrelated. Test measures have substantially lower reliability, though, as I just showed you, using the factor measures can greatly improve that. And then the analysis of covariance structure highlights some of these distinctions between measures that are essentially studying the same construct, like those different span tasks. Okay, so now I'll turn to another aspect of the study that was really inspired by a sort of a growing concern and emphasis around the predictive ability of the measures that we use in psychological science. And this is sort of highlighted in a paper published by Jake Westphal and Talia Coney a little while ago, that argued that psychology's near-exclusive emphasis on explaining the causes of behavior has led much of the field to be populated by research programs that provide intricate theories of mechanism, but that have little or unknown ability to actually predict future behaviors. And they focus in particular on both principles and methods from the field of machine learning. And one of the things when one looks at those techniques, it makes you realize that when many people in the psychology literature use the term predict, they're using it in a way that really does not live up to the implication of the term prediction. And this comes from the fact that people often use predict to basically mean correlate. Looking at the literature, you see that more often than not, when somebody has in their title, blah, 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 predicts blah, 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 what they really mean is blah, blah, blah correlates with blah, blah, blah. And the problem is that if by predict we mean that we can predict something out of sample, that is, predict on a new person, the observed correlation almost always overestimates the accuracy on a new sample. And this is shown, this is well known as in statistics, known as the concept of shrinkage. And this is because you're basically using the data twice. You're using the data to fit the model, and then you're using the data to validate the model. And one of the concepts that comes out of machine learning is that you always want to test the model on a different set of data than it was used to fit the model. And that's because the model, even very simple models, tend to overfit, that is, fit some of the noise in the data as well as the signal. And so using the cross-validation method, where you learn the model parameters from a subset of the data and then test them on the remaining data and do that iteratively across the full data set, provides a better estimate of the ability to actually predict on new samples, which ultimately is what we want to do when we talk about predictive accuracy and biomarkers and things like that. We really mean that they can apply to new data sets. So we wanted to ask whether we can predict real-world outcomes from either task or survey variables. And so we had a measure of a bunch of different sort of real-world outcomes. We applied exploratory factor analysis to those and got this set of 9 factors that reflected, different aspects of kind of, real-world outcomes, focused on things that we often associate with self-regulation. So we have drug use, we have mental health, we have obesity, we have several different aspects of drinking. We have 2 different, basically, daily smoking versus lifetime smoking. And then we have something that we think of as kind of the positive factor, which is really sort of life milestones, household income. Do you have a retirement account? Do you own a house? How much education do you have? And so on. So what I'm showing you here is a fairly complex figure. So let me unpack it. Each of the sets of bars reflects one of those different factors. What we're trying to do is predict the scores of individuals on each of those real-world outcome factors, in this case using scores from the survey measures that I told you about. Each of those has 2 bars. The light-colored bar is predictive accuracy. This is R squared in-sample prediction. That is, we fit the model to the full sample and then test it on the full sample. So that's our kind of overfit model. So that's always going to be higher than the dark blue line, which is our cross-validated prediction, where we fit the model on part of the data and then test it on the remaining data and then do that for all data points. The lines at the bottom, the little dashed red lines, show basically the 95th percentile of what we would expect under the null hypothesis, which we obtain using randomization, where we just basically randomize the labels for individuals. And one takeaway from this is that we can predict at least a significant amount of variability in each of these outcomes. Some of them we can predict really well, like mental health and obesity, where we can predict about almost 15% of the variance. Some we can't predict as well. We can predict at least a few percent of the variance, or up to say 10% for binge drinking. And then what we're showing in each of the polar plots is, again, basically which variables are playing the biggest role in that prediction. And I believe we use lasso as the regularizer for this. So basically it tells us, which variables are the most important. And what you see is that for some of them, it's really tight. So for example, for prediction of mental health, it's almost all driven by this set of variables that we call emotional control, which is things like emotion regulation. For obesity, it's driven almost exclusively by this eating factor, which is based on a set of questions about emotional eating and things like that. Whereas others, are more sort of multidimensional. So for example, unsafe drinking maps onto 4 or 5 different dimensions, as does some of the smoking measures, some of the income and lifestyle measures. Now, if we look at what happens with the task variables, the first thing I want to note here is the change in the y-axis. So in the previous plot, the y-axis went up to 40% of variance. Here, the y-axis goes up to 7.5% of variance. So you can already see that we're well below our ability to predict things with tasks than we were with surveys. And in fact, we can only predict 2 of the outcomes in an out-of-sample way significantly better than chance. That's obesity and these sort of income and life milestones. And for the income life milestones, it's almost completely driven by the discounting measures. For obesity, it's driven to some degree, most heavily by discounting, and also to some degree by response caution. And so, so the takeaway from this is really that the task measures are much poorer at predicting real-world outcomes than are the survey measures. And I mean, this is, I think, as somebody who comes from the cognitive psychology world, where what we do is develop these measures, and we think we're studying things that are like fundamentally closer to basic processes than these self-report surveys. This gives us a lot of pause, because it suggests that that at least as an individual difference measure, these are not doing a great job. And remember, these are using the factor scores that we showed to actually have fairly high reliability. And so this isn't driven. We think this is not driven primarily by reliability. So in the last few minutes, I want to talk about moving this towards what we think of as a neurocognitive ontology. Right? So we'd like to have an ontology that's both behaviorally and neurally valid. And we did some work early on with meta-analytic approaches, trying to get at this question. For example, in this paper by Lenardowitz et al., where we looked at meta-analysis for different concepts in cognitive control, and show, for example, that there doesn't seem to be any neural distinction between studies that study task switching and those that study response selection or task switching and response inhibition, suggesting that we might want to rethink our distinction between those concepts. But there's a lot of issues with meta-analysis. So what we did was bring in a set of 100 individuals and tested them on a subset of those the 37 tasks that we had used in the original behavioral study, using an algorithm to basically try to find the subset that would fit in our fMRI study and that would kind of best capture the full data matrix. And so this is the set of tasks that we ended up using, which kind of spanned a number of the different things that came out of our original study, the behavioral study. We also, I'm not going to talk about it today, but we also collected a subset of questionnaire items in the scanner, which we're really interested in looking at. So what I'm showing you here is basically taking, this is just we've only done really an initial analysis here. But if we take the whole brain fMRI data and basically cluster task variables or task conditions by basically how similar their whole brain activation patterns are, this is the initial pattern that we get. So we get 3 kind of overall clusters. One of which maps onto, a number of kind of higher order things around risk-taking and conflict and planning. Another of which measures, again, some, more attentional types of things like switch cost, but also some search measures. And then another one that seems to measure mostly sort of response time related measures, even though we had, we've separately, basically for each task, we separately model reaction time, right? So these are basically for the Stroop task, separately modeling reaction time. And what's interesting is that, again, in the context of thinking about, whether we should be treating, things that seem to measure the same thing on their face as being sort of ontologically similar, if we, people often think of conflict as measured by the attention networks task, which is sort of a flanker task, or conflict as measured by the Stroop task as being, fairly similar things. What this shows us is that, at least in terms of their neural activation patterns, they seem to be actually quite different. Whereas, the Stroop measure, even though we've pulled out reaction time, it still seems to have a neural activity pattern that's very close to what you see for reaction time differences. The ant conflict network seems to fall in a very different part that's, potentially more related to kind of strategic effects. So again, this is, lets us know that we need to think a little more deeply about, how we can interpret these particular task measures and what they're measuring in the context both of, behavioral ontologies and on these sort of emerging neural ontologies. So just to summarize, I think that this work shows us that psychology is in desperate need of a clearer ontology, and that ultimately, text mining might give us some initial insights, but it's not going to give us what we really want. We see that task performance and self-report really give us very different answers, and as a cognitive psychologist, I've always thought of the cognitive measures as really having much more mechanistic specificity, but they actually have relatively low predictive ability and sort of weak psychometrics. Though, as we showed, we can actually improve that using the factor analytic approach. So where do we go from here? So I think that clearly one generic issue is that we want I think that it shows that we need to spend more time trying to understand these kind of large-scale structural issues and potentially rethinking what some particular tasks are measuring. I think second, it tells us from the cognitive literature that we need to think a lot more about the psychometric features of our task, in particular if we want to kind of push them out into the the use in the context of individual differences. Following on the Yarkoni and Westphal point, I think we need to think about, especially if we want to talk about prediction, we need to be using the right methods to do that can really assess out-of-sample generalization. And then finally, we need to, there's a lot of work to be done still to think about how do we integrate the neuroscience evidence and the behavioral evidence to develop these sort of, emerging neurocognitive ontologies. So finally, want to thank, everybody who's funded this work, and thank my co-PIs, Lisa Marsh from Dartmouth and Dave McKinnon from Arizona State. And particularly thank Ian Eisenberg, who kind of drove the project on our side, and then Zeynep Inkabi and Patrick Bassett, who worked closely with Ian on kind of making this huge project happen. So I will stop there and take some questions.
Great. Thanks, Russ, for your presentation. It was really thought-provoking. For those that have joined online or via phone today, just so you know that you can enter your questions by clicking the Q&A button on your screen, select Ask All Panelists, and type in your question. We have one question right now, and I think it comes from probably many participants feeling a little shocked by the poor real-world prediction of the tasks. and so one of the questions is, do you still think that cognitive tasks should be considered relevant to an ontology of self-control?
Yes, I mean, I think that there's numerous ways to think about where an ontology should come from, right? And clearly an ontology should be able to describe individual differences, and it should fit with the structure that emerges when we look at individual differences. But there's probably it may well be that there's some common mechanisms that don't vary systematically or that vary very contextually, or that basically we're just not getting at, with some of these more mechanistic measures from the cognitive literature. So, I think that they are still useful. I mean, another point that's been made by others is that there's sort of a selection bias in the generation of cognitive tasks, right? That when we develop cognitive tasks, the ones that become kind of well-known and well-used are ones that always get you a significant group effect, right? So whenever you compare congruent versus incongruent reaction times on the Stroop task, you're going to get, you're almost invariably going to get a significant difference between those, right? And that means that we're maximizing kind of, the consistency across subjects by looking for those effects. And we're actually selecting out measures that would have higher variability of the effect size between individuals. And so I think that one thing that might drive us to think about is whether we can try to look for kind of, performance measures that might actually have a different trade-off of that, kind of individual variability versus kind of, effect robustness trade-off.
Great, thank you. One of the questions I have, so as you're building this ontology and understanding these relationships and the strengths of relationships, so is related to, is a part of, precedes, that kind of thing, how do you view sort of the uptake of this information and how it should drive future research?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is one study, and I wouldn't say that we need to completely reframe the way we think about the structure of the mind based on this one data set. But I would hope that this could, at least inspire people to dig more deeply around, around particular questions. So, for example, the difference between digit span and spatial span, right, which in our data seems to involve some difference in the kind of the relevance of speed and information processing. That could inspire somebody to go dig more deeply around those, individual tasks and provide kind of a hypothesis for one to go examine. So I think that that's one way I can think about it. And I think once we have the neural ontology, or at least a starting point on that, that's also going to drive us to try to, one, rethink how tasks are related. And also, those data were whole brain fMRI data, but that's almost certainly not the right way to look at this, right? It's probably the case that in different regions or different networks, there's going to be, different relationships, kind of a different ontology, or at least a different organization. And so I think that, and we're still, sort of working out our ideas for how to move into that much more high dimensional neural world to try to kind of figure out what we're going to find there. But I think that ultimately, we have to be open to the idea that, there's a set of ideas that we've been carrying around for, a century or more that are just fundamentally wrong, right? And so, psychology has, almost every real science has had a revolution where they kind of threw out folk ontologies and moved towards scientific ontologies, right? So, and I did in a blog post a couple of years ago, I did an analysis of text from psychology textbooks in the 18th century or 19th century versus chemistry or biology textbooks in the 19th century. And what you see is that, there's a substantial overlap in the terminology between psychology texts from, the 1890s and now, almost no overlap except for kind of, the very most generic terms between the way biologists talk now and the way biologists talked in the 1890s. And so I think we have to be open to the fact that, we may just need to completely rethink how we break things up. Now, ultimately, I think that probably, words, human language, natural language is probably not the right way to describe it. That what we probably want is something like a computational ontology that describes, what are the particular computations that are being done by neural systems that feed it, that are necessary for a particular, behavioral challenge or task. But we don't yet have the right language to frame that kind of computational ontology. So that's why we are starting with the kind of a natural language ontology, talking about things like working memory and response inhibition. But ultimately, I think that those are probably not, just as, in physics, you can't understand quantum mechanics without, understanding the math behind it. I think ultimately we're not going to be able to understand things like response inhibition or working memory without understanding the neural computations that are giving rise to those functions.
Great. We have a couple more questions that have come in. One is asking you to reflect on how this reflects to and relates to intelligence research, where it's an area of research where task or performance-based research as opposed to introspection has always been done in tandem with a focus on reliability. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. That is the one kind of domain of the more sort of cognitive world that where there has been focus on reliability, and we certainly found more data there. And in fact, we saw that the factor that reflected, we did find that one factor that maps, basically onto what people think of as G, right? And it was, sort of the most reliable of our factors. And so I think that our data fit well with that, and the fact that we capture it, gives some credence to the rest of what we find. I think that what we have as complementary there is because we included so many other tasks and measures, we can contextualize those in relation to the other aspects of cognitive function that that usually haven't been studied in the context of intelligence research. So things like, for example, delayed discounting or caution or just, they focus a lot on kind of information processing speed, not so much on kind of this non-decision time sort of perceptual speed. So I think our data provide sort of an impetus to look beyond G towards other aspects of cognition that we think also show reliable individual differences at the factor level, and and might tell us interesting things about how we should be breaking up cognitive functions.
Great, thank you, Russ. And wouldn't you know it, in the last 30 seconds that we have available, questions started coming in sort of fast and furious. So we'll share those with you, and if you can, provide some reflection on those questions, we'll try to get it back to the folks that answer or that ask the questions. So I just can't thank you enough for your presentation. Very interesting. Again, want to thank everybody who joined online or via the phone. If you know people who'd be interested in this but weren't able to join today, a recording of today's webinar will be available on the OBSSR website in about a month. And then I want to let people know that on Tuesday, September 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, our OBSSR Directors webinar will host Dr. Stanton Glantz of the University of California, San Francisco, who will present a webinar titled Packaging Color Research by Tobacco Companies, the Pack as a Product Characteristics. So that concludes today's webinar. Thank everyone for attending. Thanks again, Russ, and have a great day. Bye.
Thanks.